Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. 2 Bouquets. Nina's flower shop, Bloom and Bough, was not so much a place of business as it was a small, defiant jungle in the heart of Greenwich Village. Tucked into a side street where the city's roar softened to a hum, it was a jewel box of living things. The moment one crossed the threshold, the air changed. It grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp soil, the sharp green perfume of snapped stems, and above all the overwhelming velvet fragrance of roses. It was a chaotic symphony of colour. Delphiniums stood in cobalt blue columns beside the blushing coral of peonies. Ranunculus unfurled in shades of sunset orange and pale buttercup, and in the front window, like a sacred beating heart against the city's grey concrete, blazed the fiery crimson roses that had made her reputation. The shop was warm, personal, and a little wild. A perfect reflection of Nina herself. She had built it from the ground up, a sanctuary born from the ashes of relationships that had burned just as brightly and just as fast as her signature arrangements. Each one had been a grand, passionate declaration, a bonfire of exhilarating highs and gutting lows that had ultimately left her feeling scorched and empty. Her great secret wound was a creeping fear that she was a woman who could inspire only a wildfire, never the steady, life-giving warmth of a hearth. She could sell the dream of lasting love, bottle it in a vase with ferns and baby's breath, but she could not seem to cultivate it for herself. It was this boisterous context that made the weekly order feel like a whisper in a crowded room, a note of stark minimalism in her maximalist world. For 3 months, it had appeared in her online system with the unassailable punctuality of a church bell. Every Friday morning, 7 a.m. on the dot. 1 dozen long-stemmed white roses. No card, no message. The delivery address was a few blocks away. Nameless, faceless, a solemn, unchanging ritual. In the beginning, it had been just another order. But as the weeks passed, Nina found herself imbuing the task with a strange reverence. While her other creations were explosions of joy, passion, and celebration, this one felt different. It felt like a prayer. She chose the 12 stems with meticulous care, selecting buds that were just on the cusp of opening, their petals furled tight as secrets. She stripped the thorns with a gentle hand and wrapped their long, elegant stems in simple brown paper, tying them with plain twine. The bouquet was a study in quietude, in graceful sorrow. It was everything her life was not, and it fascinated her. She had built 100 narratives in her head for the anonymous buyer. A grieving widower, a penitent lover, a child honouring a lost parent. Each story was tinged with a melancholy she found both beautiful and unsettling. One particular Friday, the city wept. A cold, relentless rain fell from a bruised purple sky, slicking the streets and blurring the lights of passing cars into long watercolour streaks. The bell above her door had been silent for hours, the weather keeping even the most determined romantics at home. Her delivery courier, a cheerful kid named Leo, had called an hour ago. His bike chain snapped, his apologies profuse. Nina had been about to cancel the white rose order herself when the bell finally chimed. A soft, hesitant sound against the drumming of the rain. He filled the doorway, a tall, sombre man in a dark jacket that was beaded with rain. Water dripped from the ends of his dark hair onto the worn floorboards. He was gaunt, as if carved from something hard and unyielding, and he moved with a heavy stillness that seemed to absorb the shop's vibrant energy, quieting it. For a moment, he just stood there, his gaze sweeping over the riot of colour, a traveller washed up on the shore of a strange tropical land. "Can I help you?" Nina asked, her voice softer than she'd intended. He brought his eyes to her. They were the colour of a stormy sea, and in their depths she saw a profound, familiar sadness. It was a grief she recognised not in its particulars, but in its weight. It was the same hollowed-out look she'd seen in her own reflection after the last spectacular flame-out of her heart. "I believe you have an order," he said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble like distant thunder. The weekly one, white roses. Nina's breath caught in her throat. This was him, the ghost from her order queue, the silent patron of sorrow. He was nothing like the fragile old man she had sometimes pictured. He was formidable, grounded. The stillness she'd observed was not weakness, but a kind of tightly coiled control, an armour for a vulnerability she sensed was immense. "Yes, of course," she managed, turning to the cooler where the bouquet waited, a pale beacon in the dimming light. She brought it to the counter, the paper crinkling softly. "The courier had to cancel. I was just about to call." "I thought that might happen with the weather," he said, not quite meeting her eyes again. He pulled a worn leather wallet from his jacket. His hands were large, his fingers long and deft, but there was a faint tremor in them she might have missed if she hadn't been watching so intently. The air between them was suddenly charged with all the questions she had ever had. Who were they for? Why no card? Why this unwavering, silent devotion? But the questions felt like an intrusion, a clumsy trespass on sacred ground. So she said nothing, merely watched as he paid in cash, the crisp bills cool against her palm. He took the bouquet, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, inconsequential moment that felt anything but. He held the flowers with a carefulness that spoke of their immense importance. "Thank you," he said, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers again. It was just for a second, but it was enough. Enough for her to see the landscape of loss he carried within him. Then he turned and was gone, the bell chiming his departure, the rain swallowing him back into the grey anonymity of the city. Nina stood for a long time, the scent of rain and roses filling the sudden, profound silence of her shop. The following Friday the rain had passed, leaving behind a city washed clean and bright. Nina found herself glancing at the clock all morning, a nervous flutter in her chest that felt ridiculously adolescent. She told herself it was simple curiosity, but it was more than that. The brief, silent encounter had left an impression, like a photograph developing slowly in the darkroom of her mind. She wanted to see him again. Just after 3 the bell chimed, and he was there. Ethan. He had told her his name the week before, a simple offering in the midst of their transaction. Today he wore no jacket, just a soft grey Henley that stretched across his broad shoulders. He looked less like a ghost and more like a man, albeit one who wore his sorrow like a second skin. He began picking up the roses in person every Friday. Their conversations were at first as spare and elegant as the bouquets he bought. They spoke of the weather, of a new shipment of Dutch tulips, of the way the light changed in the shop as the afternoon wore on. Each exchange was a carefully placed stone building a tentative bridge across the chasm of their individual solitudes. He never explained the roses, and she never asked. It was an unspoken covenant, a respect for the sanctity of his ritual. One afternoon he arrived to find her perched precariously on a stool, swearing under her breath at her camera. She was trying to photograph a complex cascading arrangement of amaranth and gardenias for her website. But the light was flat, the angle was wrong, and the image on the small screen looked like a pale imitation of the vibrant reality before her. He watched her for a moment, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. "May I?" he asked, his voice gentle. Nina, flustered, nearly dropped the camera. "Be my guest. This thing and I are having creative differences." He took the camera from her, and in his hands the clumsy device became an extension of his own focused stillness. He didn't just look at the bouquet, he studied it, circling it slowly, his body moving with an unnerving grace. He adjusted a single leaf, tilted a blossom a fraction of an inch, and then, with an expert's eye, he moved to the other side of the room. The click of the shutter was a clean, decisive sound. He took only one shot. He handed the camera back to her. On the screen was her arrangement, but it was more than that. He had captured its soul, the play of shadow and light, the delicate droop of a petal, the confident spill of the greenery. It was all there, imbued with a depth and emotion she had failed to find. She breathed, genuinely stunned. "That's perfect. How did you do that?" "It's what I do," he said simply, a flicker of something, pride or perhaps just memory in his eyes. "I'm a photographer." That single frame opened a door between them. He began to linger on Fridays, arriving earlier, staying later. He would lean against the worn wooden counter, nursing a cup of tea she had made him, and watch her work. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a comforting weight, a quiet anchor in the floral chaos of her afternoons. Soon he was helping her close up, sweeping stray leaves from the floor, carrying the heavy buckets of water into the back room. One evening, long after the last customer had gone, with the shop bathed in the soft glow of a few strategically placed lamps, he finally spoke of the roses. They were surrounded by the scent of sleeping flowers, fragrance that was softer, greener than the heady perfume of the day. "They're for a bench," he said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on a pale orchid in the corner. "In the park. There's a small plaque on it." He paused and the silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the cooler. "For my partner. Her name was Sarah. She was a journalist. We were on assignment together." The confession was stark, unadorned, and for that reason devastatingly painful. Nina felt the shape of his loss, a vast empty space. In return, in that candlelit quiet, she offered him a piece of her own vulnerability. "I'm surrounded by all of this," she said, gesturing to the vibrant profusion around them, her voice barely a whisper. "I sell grand gestures, fiery, passionate, all-consuming love in the form of crimson roses." She looked down at her hands, her fingers stained with green. "But I'm terrified of it. I think that kind of love, the kind that burns so brightly, it always burns out. And I'm afraid that's the only kind I know how to inspire." They spoke for hours, of grief and passion as two different languages, one spoken in silences and memorials, the other in shouts and declarations. He saw the world in monochrome and shades of grey truth and hard-won light. She saw it in impossible, oversaturated colour. Later, as they stood by the door, he pulled out his phone. He hesitated, then swiped through a series of images. Nina braced herself for the stark reality of his work, but he scrolled past them. He stopped on one and turned the screen to her. It was not a photo of war or its aftermath. It was a field of wildflowers at dawn, somewhere impossibly green. The light was pale, ethereal, catching the dew on a million tiny petals. It was a moment of such unguarded, breathtaking beauty that it made her ache. "I took this the morning before," he trailed off, not needing to finish. It was a picture of the world as it had been, a world that still held the person he loved. As she leaned in to see the details, the soft focus on a single purple bloom, her hand resting on the counter, brushed against his. The contact was a spark, a sudden jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was a silent acknowledgement of the fragile, tenacious life stirring between them, a fragile bloom in the winter of his grief. He didn't pull away, neither did she. The air hummed, thick with the delicate friction between his contained sorrow and her vibrant, irrepressible life force. She found herself studying the lines of exhaustion and sorrow etched around his eyes, and was filled with an overwhelming, previously unimaginable urge to stay, to simply stand with him in the quiet, fragrant dark. The fragile peace they had cultivated in the quiet sanctuary of the shop was not destined to last. The world outside, with its noise and its demands, eventually came calling for Ethan. An old colleague, an editor at a prestigious photography journal, had been hounding him for months to submit his work from that final fatal assignment. It was a portfolio he had buried, both literally and figuratively, on a hard drive in the back of a closet. Finally, worn down by persistence and a small traitorous flicker of professional pride he thought had died with Sarah, he relented. He was nominated as a finalist for the prestigious Allard Prize. With the nomination came a sudden, unwelcome glare of attention. A major magazine wanted to run a feature story. A gallery in Chelsea planned an exhibit showcasing the work of all the finalists. Suddenly, the memories he had so carefully armoured himself against were being printed, framed, and lauded. The images were brutal, honest, a testament to his unflinching eye. They were filled with the noise of chaos, the grey dust of collapsed buildings, the stark, unbearable intimacy of death. He told Nina about the exhibit, his voice carefully neutral, as if discussing a distant acquaintance. He invited her to the opening, an invitation that felt more like a warning. She accepted, her heart a tangled knot of pride for his talent and a deep humming dread. She wanted to know all the parts of him, even the broken ones. She just hadn't understood how sharp those pieces would be. The gallery was a world away from Bloom and Bow. It was all white walls, polished concrete floors, and hushed, reverent silence. The air was sterile, cold. Nina, in a simple dark blue dress, felt like an exotic bird that had strayed into a laboratory. She found Ethan's section at the far end of the main room, and she stopped breathing. The man who had taken these photographs was a stranger. The gentle, quiet man who helped her sweep leaves and who could capture the soul of a flower was nowhere to be found in these frames. Here was the man who had stared into the abyss. A photo of a small child, face caked in dust, staring with ancient eyes from the rubble of her home. The twisted metal of a bombed-out market, a single bright red scarf snagged on a shard of steel. And the final largest piece, a portrait of a woman, laughing, her face alight with fierce intelligence and joy, a camera slung around her neck. Sarah. The caption beneath it was simple: Sarah Jenkins, near Holmes. It was the last photograph he ever took of her. The violence, the raw, unfiltered despair in the images struck Nina with physical force. It was a language of horror she could not comprehend. This was the ghost he was running from, and seeing it laid bare in stark black and white terrified her. A chasm opened up in her mind, wide and dark, between the man who arranged white roses on a memorial bench and the artist who had captured this unending scream of human suffering. A cold doubt, insidious and chilling, flooded her. Was his heart just a memorial bench, a space dedicated entirely to the past, with no room for new life to grow? Could her small, colourful world ever truly touch his? From across the crowded gallery, Ethan watched her. He had been dreading this moment, this collision of his two worlds. He saw the shock on her face, the way the colour drained from her cheeks. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes as she looked from the photos to him and back again. And in that moment, his deepest, most guarded insecurity was confirmed. His trauma was a contagion. His darkness was a poison that would inevitably extinguish her light. He was toxic. He saw her turn and walk away, swallowed by the crowd without a backward glance. The polite applause for some speech being made on the far side of the room sounded like the roar of an inferno. The next Friday, the 7:00 order for 12 white roses did not come. The silence in her inbox was a definitive damning judgment. Nina waited all day, her hope dwindling with the fading afternoon light. He didn't come. She sent a hesitant text. "Are you okay?" It remained unread. Days turned into a week. Ethan had disappeared. He retreated into the silent grey emptiness of his apartment, the polar opposite of her shop. He was convinced that his withdrawal was an act of kindness, a painful but necessary amputation to protect her from the gangrene of his past. He had allowed himself a brief, beautiful respite in her world of life and colour, but he didn't belong there. He was a creature of shadow, and he had no right to stand in her sun. Nina, meanwhile, misinterpreted his silence completely. To her, it was proof that their connection had been nothing more than a temporary solace for him, a brief stop on his journey of grief, another beautiful thing destined to wilt and die. It confirmed her own deepest fear, that she was only a fleeting passion, a momentary distraction, never the destination. Surrounded by the bold, screaming red of her signature roses, she felt utterly, hopelessly colourless. She had been a fool to believe that love could be a quiet thing. Love, for her, was always loud, and its silence was always the sound of it ending. The night of the Allard Prize ceremony arrived on a wave of frigid November air. Nina knew Ethan was expected to win. The critics had all but declared it. The thought of him standing on a stage celebrated for the very horror that had driven them apart was a bitter pill. For days she had moved through her shop like a phantom, the vibrant colours and scents a mocking reminder of the grey hollowness inside her. But as the evening approached, a familiar, defiant spark began to smouldering within her. It was the same fire that had allowed her to build a life from ashes before. She would not let him disappear into his ghosts. She would not let their story end in a silent, misunderstood retreat. With trembling, determined hands, she began to work. She selected a single perfect red rose. Its petals were the colour of deep arterial blood, velvety and just beginning to unfurl. She placed it in a simple, elegant black vase, its solitary beauty a stark, powerful statement. It was the kind of arrangement she was famous for, the kind that spoke of grand, unequivocal passion. She wrote a simple note on a thick cream card. The red rose whispers of passion. She left the rest of the line unwritten, a question hanging in the air. She called a courier and had it delivered to his table at the awards dinner. It was a final, desperate plea, a reminder of her language, of the world he had briefly inhabited. Ethan saw the rose the moment he sat down. It was an impossible splash of colour in the sea of black tuxedos and glittering gowns. It was Nina. It was her fire, her challenge, her life force, delivered to the heart of his monochrome world. He read the card, the unfinished line a brand on his conscience. He spent the entire ceremony in a haze, the speeches and applause a distant roar. When his name was called as the winner, he moved towards the stage like a man in a dream. He accepted the heavy glass award, his hand closing around its cold, sharp edges. He looked out at the sea of expectant faces, cleared his throat, and spoke into the microphone. "Thank you," he said, his voice clipped and raw. There is no honour in photographing suffering. There is only a duty to witness it. A duty I failed." Before the stunned silence could break, he placed the award on the podium, turned, and walked off the stage. He found her waiting outside, huddled in her coat against the biting wind, her breath pluming in the cold night air. The city lights glittered around them, hard and indifferent. For a long moment they just stared at each other, the space between them humming with everything left unsaid. He spoke first, his voice ragged. "You shouldn't have come." "You didn't give me a choice," she countered, her own voice tight with unshed tears. "You just disappeared. You let me believe I was protecting you," he broke in, his control finally shattering. "Did you see those photos, Nina? Did you see what that world is? It breaks everything and it touches. It broke me. I'm a landscape of ghosts and ruins. I can't drag you into that. I won't let my darkness put out your light." Her anger flared, fierce and righteous. "My light is not that fragile," she cried, taking a step closer, invading his space. "And your darkness isn't who you are. It's what happened to you. I see your wounds, Ethan. I'm not afraid of them, but I am afraid of this silence. I don't want your ghosts or your self-imposed penance. I want you, the man who knows how to capture the soul of a flower, the man who makes me tea and helps me sweep the floor, the man who stood with me in the dark." Her voice broke on the last word. "I am falling in love with you, and you are trying to edit me out of your story like a bad photograph." His face crumpled, the carefully constructed walls of his composure turning to dust. "I don't know how," he whispered, a confession of utter defeat. "I don't know how to be that man for you." "Then let me show you." She closed the final distance between them, rising on her toes to meet his lips. Their first kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, hungry collision on a cold New York street. It was a storm of grief and hope, anger and longing. It tasted of salt and cold air and the profound, aching relief of a dam breaking. His arms came around her, pulling her tight against him, a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. The fire she had always craved, the grand passion she equated with love, was finally here. But it wasn't the frivolous, fleeting blaze she had known before. This was different. It was a purifying flame born of shared pain and a terrifying, beautiful acceptance. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers, their breath mingling in the frozen air. "Come home with me," he said, the words both a plea and a promise. He took her back to his apartment. As the door swung open, she saw it as she had imagined it. Minimalist grey, a space devoid of colour. But for the first time, she didn't see it as empty. She saw it as a canvas, a space waiting for life. Their intimacy was a transcendent act of healing. There was no hurry, no frantic grasping. It was a slow, deliberate, reverent exploration, a mapping of scars, both visible and invisible. In the low light of his bedroom, he undressed her with hands that trembled slightly, his photographer's eyes tracing the lines of her body as if committing them to memory. She, in turn, met his vulnerability with a fierce tenderness, her fingers tracing the tense line of his shoulders, the faint, silvery scars on his back. She kissed each one, a silent vow to love the history written on his skin. This was a surrendering. He, a man who had made his name by seeing, finally allowed himself to be truly seen, his brokenness laid bare, and she, a woman who feared the silence, learned its language. Their bodies spoke what words could not, the slide of skin against skin, the whisper of a name against a throat, the rhythm of their breathing falling into a shared cadence. It was a sensual and deeply vulnerable communion, a physical manifestation of her bringing colour into his grey world and in bringing a profound, steadying depth into hers. He drew her near, their bodies meeting softly with a slow, sacred rhythm. He watched her face, saw the acceptance, the desire, the unwavering love in her eyes, and felt something inside him knit together. It was a reverence for the flesh, a hallowed connection, the body as the soul's most honest expression. In her arms, with her name a prayer on his lips, Ethan realised that love wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing the scars. It was about finding the one person willing to hold the light for you while you navigated the darkness. It was about letting them help you carry the weight. And as Nina held him, feeling the solid, living warmth of him, she understood that the most powerful passion wasn't a sudden blaze that consumes everything in its path, but the unwavering, constant flame that stays lit in the darkest of rooms. In the aftermath, in the quiet of the dawn filtering through the large, bare windows of Ethan's apartment, a new kind of peace settled between them. The world outside remained, with all its demands and its ghosts, but its power over him felt diminished, held at bay by the simple, profound reality of Nina's presence beside him. A week later, he was offered a lucrative, high-profile assignment to document post-conflict rebuilding in Eastern Europe. The old Ethan would have taken it in a heartbeat, seeking the familiar solace of the road, the anaesthetic of the camera lens. This Ethan, the man who had been resurrected in a flower shop, turned it down without a moment's hesitation. He chose to stay. He chose her. Instead, he began a new project, a personal one. He titled it Bloom and Bough. It was a photo series dedicated to capturing the secret, vibrant life of the city that Nina had shown him, the beauty that flourished in the cracks of the concrete. He photographed the early morning light hitting the buckets of flowers outside her shop, the gnarled hands of a woman tending her window box in the West Village, the riot of colour in a community garden in the Bronx. His work found a new voice, a new depth. The stark honesty was still there, but it was now balanced with a tenderness, a reverence for life's stubborn, fragile beauty. The shadow was still present, but now it served only to accentuate the light. Nina's work began to change too. Her arrangements, once defined by their bold, passionate declarations of red, grew more complex, more nuanced. She started incorporating more variety, more subtlety. She wove in the soft blues of forget-me-nots, the gentle lavender of lilac, and even, to her own surprise, the delicate, hopeful presence of pure white roses. Her art was no longer just about the fire. It was about the entire garden, the quiet growth as much as the full, spectacular bloom. Weeks later, on a crisp Friday morning, the bell above her door chimed. Ethan walked in, the early sun catching the silver in his dark hair. He wasn't there for his usual order. His hands were empty, save for his ever-present camera slung over his shoulder. He watched her for a moment, a slow, easy smile spreading across his face, a smile that reached the depths of his storm-grey eyes and calmed the seas. "I have something for you," he said. He hadn't brought flowers, he had come to make them. He moved behind her counter with a newfound familiarity, his quiet confidence a comforting presence in her space. He went to her buckets, the ones filled with the day's freshest offerings, and began to choose stems. His selections were deliberate, his movements as precise and artful as when he held his camera. Nina watched, her heart swelling as he built a bouquet. When he was finished, he turned and presented it to her. It was breathtaking. At its very centre stood a single perfect red rose, its petals a rich, deep crimson. But surrounding it, supporting it, was a soft, cloud-like embrace of a dozen long-stemmed white roses, their pristine petals just beginning to open. It was their two languages, their two worlds, woven together into a single harmonious whole. Tucked into the twine was a small cream card, the same kind she had sent to him. On it, in his strong, clean handwriting, was the rest of the line, "And the white rose breathes of love." He had learned to speak both languages. Nina looked up from the impossible perfect bouquet, her eyes shimmering with tears she didn't bother to hide. And he was there, his camera raised, not to document sorrow or capture a fleeting moment of beauty, but to capture her, his forever subject. The woman who was both the fire and the hearth, bathed in the golden morning light of the world they had built together. The shutter clicked, a clean, decisive sound, the sound of a new beginning. Midnight Confessions. The party was a sensory assault, a maelstrom of freshman freedom that hit Emma with the force of a physical blow. The air thick and sweet with the cloying scent of cheap beer, perfume and the effervescent tang of possibility vibrated with a bass line that seemed to pulse in her very bones. Neon and string lights, a modern echo of an Austin ballroom's candlelight, cast shifting, intimate shadows on the writhing mass of bodies that filled the cramped apartment. It was a chaotic tapestry of youth and abandon, a place where a single moment of connection could feel like discovering a pocket of perfect, profound silence in the heart of a storm. Emma stood at the edge of the chaos, a solitary island in a sea of revelry, nursing a plastic cup of something vaguely alcoholic. Her vulnerability was a quiet, aching loneliness, a familiar companion born from years of unrequited love for her best friend, Jake. He was across the room, a radiant sun in his own solar system of admirers, his laughter a bright, melodic counterpoint to the thumping music. He moved with an easy, unthinking confidence, a charm that seemed as natural to him as breathing. He was at home in the crowd in a way Emma never could be. His emotional wound was a deep-seated fear of change, a quiet terror of the shifting sands of life beyond their shared history. Their friendship was his anchor, a steady point in a world that threatened to pull him in 1,000 different directions. He was blissfully, painfully oblivious that he was the source of her quiet agony. She watched him now, a familiar pang of longing twisting in her gut as he threw his head back in laughter, his arms slung casually around the shoulders of a girl whose name Emma didn't know and didn't want to know. It was a scene she'd witnessed 1,000 times, in a dozen different settings, a constant, painful reminder that she was on the outside of his romantic world, a permanent fixture in the landscape of his life, but never the focus of his gaze. Fueled by a potent mix of cheap vodka and the heady, intoxicating promise of college, a place for reinvention, a chance to shed the skin of her high school self and emerge as someone new, someone bold, she felt a reckless surge of courage. It was a desperate, electrifying impulse, a voice in the back of her mind whispering, "Why not now? Why not you?" She set her cup down on a cluttered bookshelf, the plastic sticking for a moment to a ring of condensation. Then, with a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic fluttering in her chest, she began to walk. The crowd parted before her, a sea of faces turning and then turning away, oblivious to the momentous journey she was undertaking. She moved with a singular purpose, her eyes fixed on Jake, a magnetic pull drawing her toward him. He saw her then, his easy smile faltering for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to greet her with the casual, familiar warmth that was so much a part of their friendship, but she gave him no time. She reached him, her hand closing around his wrist, her touch a silent, urgent command. "Emma? What's up?" he asked, his voice a bewildered murmur against the thumping bass. She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled him, her grip surprisingly strong, her determination a force he couldn't resist. She led him away from the pulsing heart of the party, away from the laughter and the music and the swirling lights, into the relative quiet of the narrow hallway that led to the bedrooms. The air here was cooler, the music a muffled heartbeat against the thin walls. He was still looking at her, a question in his eyes, a half smile playing on his lips, when she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was an impulsive, clumsy, desperate act, a collision of lips and teeth and pent-up emotion. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic drumbeat that echoed the music of the party. His lips were warm, surprised, and for a breathtaking, electrifying moment they responded. It was a kiss that shattered the careful, fragile equilibrium of their friendship, a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. And in the sudden, terrifying thrill of that moment, with the scent of beer and cheap perfume and possibility filling the air around them, Emma felt a dizzying, terrifying hope bloom in the desolate landscape of her heart. The world, for a single breathless instant, seemed to hold its breath, and in the silence she heard the frantic, hopeful beating of her own heart, a sound that was both a prayer and a lament. The kiss, a clumsy, impulsive collision of longing and liquid courage, hung in the air between them, a fragile, shimmering thing that threatened to shatter at the slightest touch. In the immediate aftermath they retreated to the familiar, well-worn paths of their friendship, seeking refuge in the safety of old routines. Late-night study sessions in the hushed, cavernous expanse of the university library, its towering shelves of books, silent witnesses to their shared history, and movie marathons in the cosy, cramped confines of Jake's dorm room, became their sanctuary. but the sanctuary was no longer a place of perfect, uncomplicated peace. A new, unspoken tension had taken root, a delicate, almost painful awareness that had not existed before. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the ghost of a kiss that lingered on their lips. The change was subtle at first, a series of small, almost imperceptible shifts in the landscape of their friendship. During a cram session for midterms, Jake found himself distracted not by the dense, impenetrable text of his political science textbook, but by the way the warm, golden light of the desk lamp caught in the soft brown strands of Emma's hair, turning them to threads of spun gold. He watched, mesmerized as she chewed on the end of her pen, a small, thoughtful frown creasing her brow, and felt a sudden, unfamiliar ache in his chest, a yearning he couldn't name. Later, curled up on his bed, the flickering light of the television casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, he became acutely, almost painfully aware of the warmth of her thigh pressed against his. It was a casual, unconscious touch, a proximity they had shared 1,000 times before, but now it felt different, charged with a new, unspoken significance. He could feel the heat of her skin through the thin fabric of her jeans, a warmth that seemed to seep into him, a slow, spreading fire that left him breathless and confused. They began to talk, not about the movie or their classes or the latest campus gossip, but about their real, unspoken fears. The fear of failing a class, of disappointing their parents, of not knowing who they were supposed to be in this new, overwhelming world of college. It was a deeper, more profound vulnerability than they had ever shared before, a stripping away of the carefully constructed facades they presented to the world and to each other. He confessed his fear of the future, of the vast, unknowable expanse of life that stretched before him, a terrifying, uncharted territory that he was afraid to navigate alone. She, in turn, spoke of her own insecurities, of the gnawing, persistent feeling that she was not enough, that she was destined to be a supporting character in her own life, a spectator rather than a participant. The awkwardness of the kiss began to melt away, replaced by a tentative, fragile new dynamic. A casual touch became a lingering caress as he brushed her hand, his fingers tracing the delicate lines of her palm. He started walking her back to her dorm every night, their goodbyes growing longer and quieter, the space between them filled with a silent, unspoken longing. One night, under the dim, watery light of a campus streetlight, he leaned in, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher, his lips just inches from hers. She held her breath, her heart a frantic, fluttering bird in her chest, but at the last second he pulled back, his inner conflict a palpable thing in the cool night air. The central tension between them was a constant, simmering presence, a live wire that hummed with a dangerous, unspoken energy. Every shared textbook, every accidental touch, every quiet moment in the close, intimate confines of their dorm rooms became a source of simmering desire and restraint. He was fighting his own surprising, overwhelming longing, a feeling that was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. And she, in turn, was aching for him to finally see her, to see the woman she was becoming, the woman who had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. The burgeoning intimacy between them, the fragile, beautiful thing that had begun to bloom in the wake of their kiss, was a territory Jake was not yet brave enough to explore. Panicked by the depth of his own feelings, by the terrifying, exhilarating pull he felt toward Emma, he made a desperate, clumsy move to restore the old familiar status quo. He was a man adrift in a sea of change, and their friendship had always been his anchor, the one constant in a world that was constantly in flux. The thought of losing it, of risking the one thing that had always been a certainty in his life, was a fear that was greater than any other. And so, in a moment of cowardice that he would later come to regret with a bitterness that was as sharp as a physical pain, he began to casually date a girl from his chemistry class. Her name was Sarah, and she was pretty and smart and funny, but she was not Emma. She was a buffer, a public and painful declaration of his intention to remain firmly in the friend zone, a shield against the overwhelming, terrifying force of his own heart. The external conflict was this new, unsuspecting girl. The internal conflict was Jake's own cowardice, his fear of the unknown, his desperate, misguided attempt to outrun his own heart. Emma saw them together at the student union, their heads bent close together over a shared textbook, their laughter a bright, careless sound that seemed to mock her own secret, fragile hope. They were holding hands, their fingers intertwined in a casual, intimate gesture that was like a physical blow to her heart. The sight of it, the easy, uncomplicated intimacy of it, was a definitive, unspoken answer to her impulsive, desperate kiss. She had been rejected, not with words, but with a casual, public display of affection for another woman. The humiliation of it was a cold, bitter pill to swallow. She had not only been rejected, she had made a fool of herself, had risked their friendship, their long, beautiful, complicated history, for a moment of reckless, impulsive hope, and she had lost. She retreated, a wounded animal seeking the safety of her den. The late-night study sessions ceased. The movie marathons came to an end. Her texts went unanswered. Her calls went to voicemail. The silence between them was a vast, empty chasm, a void that was filled with the ghosts of unspoken words and unfulfilled desires. Emma threw herself into her studies, her loneliness a cold, hollow ache in her chest. She felt utterly exposed, naive, a fool for having believed, for even a moment, that a single kiss could change the course of their lives. She built a wall around her heart, a fortress of books and lecture notes and late-night study sessions in the library, a place that was once a sanctuary, but was now a constant, painful reminder of what she had lost. Jake, meanwhile, found that his return to normal was anything but. The easy, uncomplicated relationship he had sought with Sarah felt empty, a pale imitation of the deep, meaningful connection he had shared with Emma. The absence of her late-night texts, her easy laughter, her quiet, steady presence in his life left a void that was far larger and more painful than he could have ever imagined. The friendship he had been so desperate to save was already dead, and he was the one who had killed it. The silence on the other end of the phone was a deafening roar, a constant, painful reminder of his own cowardice, his own foolish, misguided attempt to outrun the one thing that had ever truly mattered. The tone between them was stormy, aching, and silent. The air was heavy with regret, with the suffocating weight of unspoken desires and unfulfilled promises. The line had been crossed, the fragile, beautiful thing they had shared was broken, and they were both left to navigate the wreckage of their own making, alone in the silence. The evening air was heavy and still, thick with the scent of damp earth and the unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. A low, oppressive blanket of clouds had swallowed the last of the daylight, plunging the campus into an early twilight. Emma was walking across the quad, the silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic, when she saw him. Jake, a solitary figure under the weak glow of a lamppost, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of misery that was a perfect mirror of her own. The sight of him, so utterly, completely wretched, was the spark that ignited the tinderbox of her own pain and frustration. All the hurt, all the anger, all the unspoken words that had been churning inside her boiled over. She changed course, her steps quickening on the flagstone path, a warrior marching into a battle she could no longer avoid. She confronted him, her voice breaking but strong, the words tumbling out in a torrent of pain and anger. Was I just a placeholder, Jake? Someone to kill time with until someone better came along? I need to know. Am I just your buddy, or am I the love of your life? Because I can't live in the middle anymore. Her ultimatum, raw and desperate and stripped of all pretense, shattered his carefully constructed defences. He finally looked at her, his eyes dark with a pain that was as real and as visceral as her own. He confessed the truth, his voice raw and ragged in the heavy air. He spoke of his fear, of his stupidity, of his terrifying, heart-stopping realization that his life was meaningless without her in it. "The whole time I was with her," he said, his voice a ragged whisper, "all I could think about was you. It's always been you, Em. I was just too scared to see it." The raw, desperate honesty of their confessions, the stripping away of all the layers of fear and uncertainty and doubt broke the dam of their restraint. He pulled her into his arms, and their kiss was no longer impulsive or tentative, but deep and claiming, a fusion of tears and years of pent-up emotion. It was a kiss that spoke of homecoming, of a love that had been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. The need to be alone, to be away from the prying eyes of the campus, was a palpable, urgent thing. He led her back to his room, their hands clasped tightly, their bodies trembling with an emotion that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, the confrontation melted into a night of fierce, vulnerable, and transcendent intimacy. It began with their clothes, shed in a desperate and fumbling haste, a shedding of old identities, best friend, buddy, placeholder, until they stood before each other, raw and new. His hands, no longer hesitant, explored the familiar territory of her body with a reverence that was almost holy, but it was a reverence charged with years of suppressed hunger. He touched her, as if she were a precious, fragile thing he had only just discovered, his fingers tracing the lines of her face, her neck, her shoulders, as if memorizing a sacred text. His lips followed, blazing a slow, deliberate trail of fire that left her shivering in his arms. He kissed her with a hunger that was both fierce and tender, lingering over her lips before drifting to her ear. His breath was warm as he whispered words meant only for her, sweet nothings that made her laugh softly, the sound breaking into a breathless squirm when his teeth caught playfully at her earlobe. His mouth wandered lower, tracing the delicate line of her neck with kisses that carried both reverence and want, leaving a heated path that made her pulse race beneath his lips. She arched toward him, her body alive to every touch, every pause. When his mouth reached her chest, he didn't rush. He took his time, lavishing attention, as though each peak of desire was a discovery worth worshipping. Her soft cries filled the room, a mixture of delight and longing, her hands threading through his hair to keep him close. Still lower he moved. A trail of kisses spilled across her ribs, her stomach, her trembling skin. He lingered at her belly button, teasing, drawing from her another breathless laugh that dissolved into a sigh. And then, slowly, deliberately, he continued further down, every touch an unspoken vow, every kiss growing hotter, more demanding. He knelt before her, his gaze intense, a silent question she answered with a trembling nod, and then he brought her to the heart of her most intimate place, his mouth a source of exquisite, unbearable pleasure. It was a revelation, a complete and total surrender. Emma, who had spent years hiding her desire, felt it bloom under his touch, a wild, untamable thing. Her fingers tangled in his hair, her hips arching, as if drawn by a magnetic pull she could no longer resist. The world narrowed to this single searing point of contact, a symphony of sensation that built and built until it shattered her into 1,000 pieces. Her release a raw, keening cry. Echoed in the quiet room. Before the aftershocks had even faded, he was rising, lifting her into his arms and carrying her to the bed. He came to her then, his body covering hers, and the years of unspoken longing, of quiet, secret desire, were unleashed in the powerful, primal rhythm of their intimate communion. It was a dance of two souls, a frantic, desperate claiming. They moved as one, a fusion of longing and devotion, his eyes locked on hers, and in their depths, she saw not just desire, but a profound, soul-deep recognition. This was not just sharing of intimacy, it was a consecration, a physical manifestation of a love that had finally found its voice. Their climax was a shared, shuddering crest, a wave of pure sensation that washed away all the pain and misunderstanding, leaving only the raw, beautiful truth of their connection. Emma, who had always felt that her vulnerability was a weakness, a flaw to be hidden away, learned that it was, in fact, her greatest power. It was her vulnerability that had allowed her to love him so completely, so unconditionally, and it was her vulnerability that had finally broken through his own walls of fear and doubt. Jake, in turn, understood that true love wasn't the absence of risk, but the courage to risk everything for it. He had been so afraid of losing her that he had almost lost her for good. And in that moment, in the quiet, intimate aftermath of their passion, he knew that he would never make that mistake again. They woke to the quiet hum of the world coming to life. There was no thunder, no dramatic reveal, only the soft grey light of dawn filtering through the blinds of Jake's dorm room, painting stripes across the tangled sheets and their sleeping forms. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth, a clean, fresh scent that felt like a new beginning. Emma stirred first, her senses slowly coming online, the comforting weight of Jake's arm draped across her waist, the steady rhythm of his breathing against her back, the unfamiliar texture of his pillow beneath her cheek. The awkwardness she had anticipated, the morning after anxiety that was a staple of movies and cautionary tales, was simply not there. In its place was a profound, almost startling sense of peace, a feeling of rightness that settled deep in her bones. She lay still, not wanting to break the spell, watching the dust motes dance in the slanted bars of light. He woke slowly, his breath catching for a moment before he pulled her closer, his lips finding the curve of her shoulder. "Hey," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Hey," she whispered back, a smile in her voice. Their friendship, the thing that had been the bedrock of their lives for so long, was not lost. It had been transformed, a sturdy, unshakable foundation upon which they could now build their love. They rediscovered each other in the quiet hours of that morning, not as best friends but as partners, their shared history a rich, fertile ground from which their new love could grow. They talked in low voices, their words weaving a new tapestry of shared dreams and whispered confessions, the conversation as easy and natural as breathing. A week later they found themselves at another party, a loud, crowded affair that was a mirror image of the one where their story had begun. But this time everything was different. This time Jake never left her side. His hand was a constant warm presence in hers, his fingers intertwined with hers in a silent public declaration of their new, shared reality. He drew her closer, until the rest of the world was just a muffled roar around them, and his lips found the shell of her ear. "I spent so long looking past you," he murmured, his voice thick with the weight of his regret and the depth of his love. "Never again. You're the centre of my world now." He then turned her face to his and kissed her, a soft, possessive kiss that was both a beginning and an end, the end of their old story and the beginning of their true one. It was a quiet vow made in the heart of the noise sealing their future. The world around them, with its laughter and its swirling chaotic energy, faded into the background. In that moment, there was only the two of them, a solitary island in a sea of revelry, a pocket of perfect, profound silence in the heart of the storm. And in that silence Emma heard the steady, triumphant beating of her own heart, a sound that was no longer a lament, but a song of a love that had finally, beautifully bloomed. the Orchard Heir. The air in Bishop's Orchard, as it was still called in the waning months of 1880, was thick with the ghosts of sweetness. Autumn had laid its heavy honeyed hand upon the land, and the scent of fallen apples, slowly returning to the earth from which they had sprung, mingled with the crisp, almost sharp perfume of decaying leaves. It was a scent of both an ending and a beginning, a metaphor for the orchard itself, which, once the pride of Eleonora's late uncle, now lay in a state of beautiful, tragic neglect. The farmhouse, a sturdy, weathered sentinel at the edge of the trees, seemed to sag a little, as if weary of holding the memories of a simpler time within its clapboard walls. Eleonora, or Nora, as she had been called in a life she barely remembered, stepped from the hired carriage, her elegant Boston skirts whispering their protest against the damp, uneven ground. The fabric, a deep city blue, was entirely impractical for this rustic world, as were the delicate, uncalloused hands she kept tucked in a small muff. The inheritance, this sprawling tract of land she had never seen, felt more like a burden than a gift, a symbol of a life she had never known and a future she did not want. Boston, with its rigid expectations and stifling drawing rooms, was a cage she understood. This wild, untamed place with its scent of cider and soil was a wilderness she could not comprehend. She had been told there would be a man, a farmhand her uncle had employed, to see to the running of the place. A childhood friend, the lawyer had said, though the memory was a faint, sepia-toned image in the back of her mind. Samuel Cole. The name was as unfamiliar as the landscape. She found him high in the branches of an old gnarled apple tree, its limbs twisted like the arthritic fingers of an ancient crone. He was pruning a dead branch, the rhythmic rasp of his saw the only sound in the still afternoon air. He was a man made of the very earth he tended, broad-shouldered and sun-weathered, his hands, even from this distance, stained with the soil he loved. He did not seem to hear her approach, so intent was he on his task. "Mr. Cole?" she called up, her voice feeling thin and reedy in the vast open space. He stilled his saw, but did not immediately look down. When he did, his eyes, the colour of a stormy sky, were shadowed by a suspicion that bordered on hostility. He took in her elegant attire, the impracticality of her presence, and a muscle worked in his jaw. "Miss Bishop," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be dragged from the very depths of him. It was not a question, but a statement, heavy with unspoken history. I am Eleonora Bishop," she said, feeling a sudden, absurd need to clarify, as if her name, her very identity, was something to be questioned in this place. He offered no reply, merely watched her with that same guarded expression, a mixture of nostalgic affection and deep-seated resentment she could not yet decipher. He feared, she would later learn, that she was just another city dweller, another ephemeral owner who would sell the land without a second thought, without a backward glance at the legacy it held. He swung himself down from the tree with an easy, athletic grace that seemed to mock her own constrained movements. He landed on the balls of his feet, the soft thud of his boots on the damp earth a sound of belonging. Up close he was even more formidable, his presence a solid, unyielding thing. "The lawyer said you'd be arriving," he said, his tone still gruff, challenging. "Yes, he said you would show me the house." He gestured with a jerk of his head towards the weathered farmhouse. "It's not much to look at, not what you're used to in Boston, I'd wager." There was a sharpness in his words, a barb she could not ignore. "I am not here to make comparisons, Mr. Cole. I am here to see what has been left to me." His eyes, those stormy grey eyes, flickered with something she could not name. A memory, perhaps? A ghost of a shared past? "Do you not remember me, Nora?" he asked, the use of her childhood name a sudden, startling intimacy. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, past the broad shoulders and the weathered skin, and saw the boy he had once been, the dark, unruly hair, the intense gaze, the hint of a smile that never quite reached his lips, and with a rush, a memory, as vivid and startling as a flash of lightning, returned to her. "Samuel," she breathed, the name a whisper on the autumn air. "We used to climb this very tree." A flicker of warmth, a spark of connection in the cool, crisp air. It was there for a moment, a bridge across the chasm of a decade. He looked at the tree, then back at her, and for an instant the resentment in his eyes softened, replaced by something akin to longing. "Aye," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not conceal. "We did." But the moment was as fleeting as a firefly in the dusk. The gulf between their present lives, between the Boston heiress and the orchard's farmhand, was too wide, too deep. The spark was extinguished as quickly as it had been lit, leaving them in the cold, charged silence of unspoken history, of duty and desire, of a past that could never be reclaimed, and a future that was yet to be written. With a resolve that surprised even herself, refused to be a mere spectator in her own inheritance. She would not be the delicate city flower, wilting in the face of honest labour, who would understand this land, this orchard, before she made any decision about its fate. And so, the day after her arrival, she presented herself at the barn, her impractical blue dress replaced by a simple serviceable gown of brown wool, her hands, though still uncalloused, bare and ready for work. Samuel, who was mending a broken fence post, looked up at her approach, his expression a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. "I want to help," she said, her chin held at a determined angle. "I want you to teach me." He said nothing for a long moment, merely studied her, his gaze taking in the change in her attire, the earnestness in her eyes. Then, with a curt nod, he gestured to a pile of fence rails. "The fence along the north pasture needs mending." And so began their unlikely partnership. The days that followed were a blur of shared tasks and slowly unfurling conversations. They mended fences, their hands brushing as they passed nails and hammers. They cleared overgrown branches, the sharp scent of cut wood a constant presence in the air between them. They pressed the last of the season's cider, the sticky sweetness of the apple clinging to their clothes and hair. Their conversations were stilted at first, filled with the awkwardness of two people who had once known each other as children, and now had to navigate the unfamiliar territory of adulthood. But as the days wore on, the silences became less frequent, the words more forthcoming. They spoke of the years they had spent apart, of the lives they had led, of the dreams they had held and the disappointments they had faced. Nora, in a moment of vulnerability, confessed the suffocating loneliness of her life in Boston, the constant pressure of society's expectations, the fear of making the wrong choice, of failing to live up to a legacy she did not understand. Samuel, in turn, spoke of his devotion to her uncle, of his love for the land, of the quiet satisfaction he found in the rhythm of the seasons. In the dim golden light of the barn, with the scent of hay and earth surrounding them, he revealed a vulnerability beneath his rugged exterior, a gentleness that softened the hard edges of his resentment. One evening, as they were herding the pigs into their pen, a mischievous piglet made a dash for freedom, leading them on a clumsy, muddy chase through the orchard. They slipped and slid in the mud, their laughter echoing through the trees, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. When they finally cornered the errant piglet, they were both breathless and covered in mud, their faces flushed, their eyes bright. In that moment, the barriers between them seemed to crumble, replaced by a shared, unguarded mirth. The romantic progression when it came was as natural and as potent as the turning of the seasons. Samuel was teaching her the delicate art of grafting, of joining a new apple variety to an old established rootstock. His hands, calloused and strong, guided hers, his fingers a warm, firm presence on her skin. The touch was electric, a silent acknowledgement of the attraction that had been growing between them. as steady and as sure as the roots of the apple trees themselves. The air grew thick with unspoken feelings, with the scent of apple blossoms and the heat of their proximity. He leaned in, his gaze fixed on her lips, and she felt herself leaning towards him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The world seemed to narrow to the space between their mouths, to the promise of a kiss that would seal the unspoken words that hung in the air between them. But the moment was broken by the distant solemn toll of the church bell, a reminder of the world outside the orchard, of the roles they were meant to play, of the duties that bound them. They drew apart, the spell broken, but the memory of that near kiss, of the electric touch of his hands on hers, lingered, a silent, potent promise of what was yet to come. The arrival of Mr. Alastair Finch from Boston was as jarring as the screech of a train whistle in the tranquil quiet of the orchard. He was a man of the city, slick and polished, his fine wool suit and gleaming leather shoes a stark contrast to the rustic simplicity of the farmhouse. He brought with him the scent of money and ambition, the very things Nora had sought to escape. He was the embodiment of the life she was supposed to want, the life of ease and luxury her inheritance could provide. He had come with an offer, a lucrative one, from a railroad developer who saw not an orchard, but a path for progress, a line of steel and steam that would cut through the heart of the land, connecting the bustling cities of the east. The offer was staggering, a sum that could secure Nora a life of unparalleled comfort and ease, a life free from the burdens of a failing orchard and the hard, unyielding demands of the land. The external conflict was matched by an internal one that raged within Nora's heart. She was torn between her duty to her family's legacy, a legacy she was only just beginning to understand, and the logical, sensible choice to sell. The money would free her, allow her to return to Boston, to the life she knew, the life that was expected of her. But the thought of leaving the orchard, of leaving Samuel, was a sharp physical ache in her chest. Samuel, for his part, watched the proceedings with a growing sense of dread. He saw in Mr. Finch the embodiment of his worst fears, the city slicker who would come and devour the land, leaving nothing but a trail of smoke and progress in his wake. The misunderstanding, when it came, was a cruel twist of fate. Samuel, returning to the farmhouse for a tool, overheard a fragment of a conversation between Nora and the lawyer. He heard her say, "I must consider the offer. Of course, it is a great deal of money." He did not hear the uncertainty in her voice, the tremor of doubt that accompanied the words. He did not see the troubled expression on her face, the conflict that raged in her eyes. He heard only the words, and they were enough to confirm his deepest fears. Believing that she had made her decision, that she had chosen the city and the money over the land and over him, he withdrew completely. The warmth that had begun to blossom between them was extinguished, replaced by a cold, impenetrable wall of politeness. He was courteous, but distant, his words clipped, his gaze averted. He spoke to her only when necessary, his voice devoid of the warmth and intimacy that had begun to colour their interactions. Heartbroken by his sudden distance, and overwhelmed by the weight of her decision, Nora retreated into herself. The sale of the orchard, which had once seemed a distant, abstract possibility, now felt like an inevitable, painful amputation. She saw no other choice, no other path forward. Samuel, believing he had lost everything he held dear, worked himself to the point of exhaustion, his songs a form of self-punishment. He poured his grief and anger into the land, his axe a furious, relentless extension of his pain, as he cleared the deadwood from the orchard, each swing a blow against the cruel, unyielding hand of fate. The orchard, now in the grip of late autumn, seemed to mourn with them, its bare branches stark and skeletal against a grey, unforgiving sky. The scent of decaying apples was no longer one of sweet nostalgia, but of bitter, final decay. The spark that had been lit between them had been extinguished, leaving them in a cold, desolate darkness, each alone with their own private, unspoken grief. The nor'easter rolled in from the coast like a grey, angry beast, its breath a cold, damp wind that rattled the windows of the farmhouse and tore the last of the stubborn leaves from the apple trees. The sky was a bruised, tumultuous canvas of black and purple, the air thick with the scent of rain and the promise of a storm. Nora, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, found Samuel by the woodpile sharpening an axe. The rhythmic thwack of the stone against the steel was a harsh, unforgiving sound, a counterpoint to the rising fury of the wind. She had made her decision, a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a surrender. "I'm selling," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. He did not look up, his hands still moving in their steady, relentless rhythm. "Congratulations," he said, the single word a bitter, poisoned dart, and with that, the dam of their restraint broke. The carefully constructed walls they had built around their hearts crumbled, and a flood of accusations and long-suppressed truths erupted between them. "You never wanted me here," she cried, her voice rising with the wind. "You saw me as an intruder, a city girl who would never understand." "And what did you expect?" he shot back, his eyes, when he finally looked at her, blazing with a cold, righteous anger. "You came here in your fine clothes with your city ways, and you looked at this place as if it were a curiosity, a chapter in a book you could close and put away when you were done. That's not true, isn't it? You were ready to sell from the moment you arrived. You saw only the neglect, the decay. You didn't see the heart of this place, the soul of it. You didn't see what it could be." "And you," she retorted, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and pain, "you saw only what you wanted to see. You saw a spoiled heiress who would sell her birthright for a life of ease. You didn't see that I was afraid of failing, of not being enough, of not being worthy of this place." The argument followed them into the barn, the wind and rain lashing at the old wood, the scent of hay and damp earth a thick, cloying presence in the air. In a moment of raw, unvarnished honesty, his voice cracking with an emotion he could no longer contain, Samuel confessed the truth that had been buried beneath his anger and resentment. "It's not just the orchard," he said, his voice a low, ragged whisper. "It's not just the land I can't bear to lose. It's you, Nora. It's you." Of course. Here is a more detailed and passionate version of the love scene from Part 4, crafted to be more erotic and romantic, drawing upon the requested inspirations. His confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, trembling thing, broken by a sudden, violent clap of thunder that shook the old barn to its foundations. And in that moment, the storm outside was mirrored by the tempest within. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands finding her face, his calloused thumbs stroking the tears from her cheeks with a reverence that undid her completely. The scent of rain and wet earth clung to him, a wild, primal smell that filled her senses. Their kiss was a desperate, hungry thing, a collision of 2 souls who had been starving for a connection they had been too proud, too afraid to admit they craved. It was not gentle. It was a raw, bruising claiming, his mouth taking hers with all the pent-up frustration and longing of the past weeks. She answered with equal fire, her hands tangling in his damp hair, pulling him closer, her body arching against his. It was a kiss of anger and forgiveness, of grief and fierce, unbridled joy. The taste of him was rain and salt and a deep, earthy sweetness that was purely Samuel. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his mouth never leaving hers, and carried her towards the ladder, to the loft. The ascent was a dizzying blur, a tangle of limbs and desperate kisses, the drumming of the rain on the tin roof, a frantic heartbeat accompanying their own. In the loft, the air was thick with the sweet, dry scent of hay. a soft golden world suspended above the storm's fury. He laid her down on a pile of soft, yielding hay, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, their breath coming in ragged gasps. In the dim light filtering through the hayloft window, his eyes burned with an intensity that stripped her bare, seeing past the Boston heiress, past the frightened girl, to the very core of the woman she was. "Nora," he breathed, the name a prayer. The anger was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective tenderness. His hands, those large, capable hands that knew the language of the earth, began to explore the landscape of her body with a slow, deliberate wonder. He fumbled with the tiny buttons of her woolen dress, his fingers, accustomed to the heft of an axe handle, clumsy against the delicate fabric. The sound of the cloth tearing slightly was a sharp, thrilling sound in the quiet loft. She didn't care. She helped him, her own fingers trembling as she worked at the laces of her corset. A garment that suddenly felt like a cage, a relic from another life. One by one the layers of her old life fell away, the dress, the petticoats, the corset, until she lay before him in the soft light, clad only in her thin chemise, her skin luminous against the dark gold of the hay. He looked at her, his gaze a slow, burning caress, and she saw not judgment, but worship in his eyes. He stripped off his own rough work shirt, revealing a torso sculpted by labour, his skin sun-bronzed and taut over hard muscle. He was beautiful, a man made of the very land she was learning to love. He came to her then, his body covering hers, the heat of his skin a shocking, delicious contrast to the cool air of the loft. His calloused hands traced the curve of her waist, the swell of her hip, the delicate line of her collarbone as if memorizing her by touch alone. He kissed her again, a slow deep kiss that spoke of a reverence for the flesh, a sacred communion of bodies and souls. His mouth moved from her lips to her throat, his tongue tracing a trail of fire down to the hollow between her breasts. She gasped, her back arching, her hands clutching at his shoulders. It was a surrender more complete, more profound than any she had ever known, a willing, eager giving of herself to this man, this storm. He moved lower, his lips and hands exploring every inch of her, awakening sensations she had never known, a deep molten heat coiling in the pit of her stomach, the scratch of the hay against her bare skin, the drumming of the rain on the roof, the sound of his ragged breathing, her own soft cries. It all merged into a symphony of the senses, a raw elemental music that stripped away all thought, all fear. He closed the last distance between them, a slow, deliberate motion that was both an act of worship and a desperate need. A soft breath escaped her as she met his gaze, her eyes wide and dark. In that moment, as their worlds merged into one, a silent vow passed between them. She met his gaze, her own eyes wide and dark, and in that moment, a silent vow passed between them. She wrapped her legs around his waist, drawing him deeper, her body accepting him, welcoming him home. Their rhythm was the rhythm of the storm, at first slow and gentle, then building in intensity, a fierce, driving cadence that echoed the wind and the rain. It was a raw, primal act of possession, a dance of two bodies moving as one, their mingled sweat a heady, intoxicating perfume. It was a physical release, but it was also an emotional transcendence, a sealing of their bond in the most intimate way imaginable. The climax, when it came, was a shattering, all-consuming wave that broke over them both, a moment of pure, blinding light that burned away all the anger, all the pain, all the misunderstanding, leaving in its wake only the pure, unadulterated truth of their love. In the aftermath, as the storm outside began to subside, they lay tangled in each other's arms, their bodies cooling, their heartbeats slowing in unison. The scent of hay and rain and their own sated flesh was a comforting, intimate perfume. He stroked her hair, his touch gentle now, his eyes full of a love so profound it stole her breath. In the quiet, spent aftermath of their passion, a new understanding dawned, a deep physical knowledge they now shared. Vulnerability was not a weakness, but a strength. Nora understood that her strength lay not in escaping her responsibility, but in embracing it. And Samuel learned that love required the risk of being hurt, the courage to open your heart to the possibility of both joy and pain. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake a clean, rain-washed world, a world of new beginnings, of hope, of a love that had been forged and finally consummated in the fire of their own private tempest. In the clear, crisp light of the morning after the storm, Nora, with a sense of clarity and purpose she had never known, tore the developer's contract into 100 tiny pieces, the fluttering white scraps a symbol of her newfound resolve. She would not sell. She would not run. She would stay. She used a portion of her inheritance not to return to Boston, but to breathe new life into the orchard. New saplings were ordered, modern equipment was purchased, and a sense of hope, as fresh and as potent as the scent of the rain-washed earth, began to permeate the old farmhouse. She and Samuel became partners in every sense of the word, their days filled with the shared labour of restoring the orchard to its former glory, their nights with the quiet intimacy of two people who had found in each other a home they had never known, their love, born in the ashes of a shared, unspoken grief, was rooted in the very soil they were fighting to save. The final scene of their story unfolded not in the golden haze of autumn, but in the tender, hopeful light of spring. The orchard was a riot of pink and white blossoms, the air alive with the buzz of bees and the sweet, intoxicating perfume of new life. They were planting the first of the new trees together, their hands meeting in the rich, dark earth as they settled the sapling into its new home. The soil was cool and damp against their skin, a tangible connection to the land, to the future they were building together. Samuel turned to her, his eyes, the colour of a spring sky after a storm, full of a quiet, unwavering devotion. He said nothing, for no words were needed. He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, lingering kiss that tasted of sunshine and apple blossoms and the promise of a future that would grow, season after season, alongside the orchard they had saved, the love they had found. It was a vow of love and renewal, a promise of a life that would be as enduring, as beautiful as the land itself. The Seamstress of Belgravia. The Reed townhouse on Belgravia Square was a monument to solemn opulence, a place where the very air seemed thick with the weight of expectation and the scent of beeswax, polished into generations of mahogany. Downstairs, in the drawing rooms and the grand dining hall, life was a carefully orchestrated performance played out against a backdrop of claret-red velvet draperies that drank the London sunlight and gas lamps that bled a weak, jaundiced glow onto portraits of stern-faced ancestors. It was a world of hushed footfalls on Turkish carpets, of the low murmur of consequential conversation, a world that belonged entirely to the Reeds. Upstairs, 3 floors above the gilded silence, was another world. The sewing room, tucked away at the end of a narrow servants' corridor, was a universe unto itself. It was a practical, cramped space, yet it held a life and energy the grand rooms below could never possess. Here the air was warm and carried the clean, honest scents of hot irons pressing damp linen, of lavender sachets tucked between bolts of fabric, and the almost living perfume of silk and wool. Sunlight, unfiltered by heavy curtains, fell in bright, dusty shafts across a large cutting table, illuminating a constellation of stray threads, silver pins and chalk marks. This was the world of Courtney Berg. Courtney's own world was one of quiet, focused labour. Her life was stitched together by the twin threads of necessity and devotion, the necessity of earning a wage, and her fierce, consuming devotion to her ailing mother, whose soft cough was the metronome to which Courtney's needle danced. She was an apprentice, a pair of hands in the employ of the esteemed Madame Dubois, but her fingers were more nimble, her eye for a seam more precise than any of the other girls. There was a stillness about her as she worked, a concentration so profound it was a form of prayer. Within this small room, she was not merely a girl mending a hem, she was an architect of dreams, coaxing flat cloths all into forms of beauty, and yet she carried within her the deep, unvoiced wound of the working class, a constant gnawing feeling of invisibility. She was a function, a service, an instrument. She was rarely a person. Mr. Darren Reed, by contrast, was seen by everyone. He was the young master of the house, a barrister of burgeoning reputation, and since his father's recent sudden death, the reluctant patriarch of the Reed dynasty. His life was a cage of duty, its bars forged from the immense pressure to uphold his family's prestigious name. He moved through the grand, silent rooms of his home like a ghost haunting his own future. Grief and responsibility had sealed his heart behind a fortress of cynical pragmatism. He had come to believe emotion was a liability, a weakness a man in his position could ill afford. The loneliness of his self-imposed command was a burden heavier than any legal brief he carried in his leather satchel. Their two worlds, separated by a mere 39 steps of polished oak staircase, might as well have been separated by an ocean. But one Tuesday afternoon, that ocean was crossed. Darren strode into the sewing room without knocking, his presence a sudden jarring intrusion of leather and starched linen into a soft world of cambric and thread. He did not look at the two girls bent over their work, their heads bowed in silent industry. His focus was singular, his patience, as always, a finite resource. Madame Dubois, he began, his voice crisp and devoid of warmth. My sister is growing agitated. She was promised a fitting for the Derby gown an hour ago. This delay is becoming trying. The older seamstress, a plump woman with flustered eyes, rose at once. My apologies, Mr. Reed. The silk taffeta, it is temperamental, it resists the needle. Darren's gaze remained fixed on a half-finished bodice pinned to a dress form, his expression one of profound irritation. Temperamental fabric is not a sufficient explanation for my sister's distress. The fault lies, as it usually does, with inadequate preparation or a lack of skill. He gestured vaguely toward the garment. Surely the girl could work faster. He meant Courtney. Nay. He had not once glanced in her direction, yet the dismissal in his tone, the casual reduction of her to the girl, was as palpable as a slap. It was the familiar ache of being overlooked, of being rendered a piece of the furniture. A familiar resignation settled in her chest, but alongside it, something else flickered, a tiny sharp spark of defiance. She did not lift her head. Her needle continued its steady rhythmic journey through a line of pearl buttons on a cuff, a tiny silver fish darting through white water. Her voice, when it came, was low and even, utterly devoid of the deference he expected. The fault, sir, she said to the cuff in her hands, is not with the needle, but with the thread. The silk thread required for such a fine weave is prone to snapping if the tension is not precisely managed with the warp of the taffeta. Haste would only result in a puckered seam, which I imagine would cause Miss Caroline far more distress than a brief delay. The silence that followed was absolute. The other seamstress held her breath. The only sound was the delicate snick of Courtney's scissors as she snipped the thread, the task completed. Her words, so precise, so technical, so unexpectedly intelligent, hung in the air. They were not an excuse, but a statement of fact, delivered with a dry, unshakable confidence that was utterly out of place. It was the voice of an expert, not a servant. Slowly, as if compelled by a force beyond his control, Darren Reed turned his head. His gaze, which had swept over the room and its occupants as little more than a collection of objects, now fell upon the young woman with the downcast eyes and the clever voice. He saw the burnished copper of her hair, pinned in a simple severe knot at the nape of her neck. He saw the elegant line of that neck, bent in concentration, and the dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose. He saw the strength and purpose in her hands, not the delicate, idle hands of the women in his circle, but the nimble, capable hands of a creator. And when, at last, she felt the weight of his stare and lifted her head, he saw her eyes. They were the colour of moss after a rain, and in their depths he saw not subservience, but a clear, startling flicker of a spirit as proud and unyielding as his own. In that moment, she ceased to be the girl. The walls of the sewing room seemed to dissolve. The 39 steps between their worlds vanished. He saw a woman, and Courtney Berg, looking into the surprised, dark eyes of the young barrister, felt a sensation so foreign and so potent it nearly made her gasp. She felt seen. The countless fittings required for Caroline Reed's debutante season became the unlikely stage upon which their silent drama unfolded. An unspoken awareness now existed between them, a current that hummed beneath the surface of every polite exchange and stolen glance. Darren began to find excuses to be present. He would appear in the doorway of the sewing room, a volume of tort law in his hand, and settle into a worn armchair in the corner, ostensibly to study. He would turn the pages of his book with a convincing rustle, but his attention was not on the dry legal precedents. It was on her. He watched her quiet, unflagging patience as she navigated his sister's petulant whims. Caroline would complain that a waistline was a fraction too high, that a shade of blue made her look pallid, that a cascade of lace was insufficiently grand. And through it all, Courtney would murmur assent, her hands moving with a placid grace, her expression a mask of professional calm. Darren, who knew the full force of his sister's temper, found himself marvelling at the young dressmaker's diplomacy. He saw the fierce, quiet pride she took in her craft, the way her brow would furrow in concentration as she measured a seam, the small, almost imperceptible smile that touched her lips when a difficult drape finally fell into perfect submission. He saw not just a skill, but an artistry, and it fascinated him. One evening, well after the rest of the household had settled into the rhythms of the night, he was descending the main staircase when a sliver of light from under the sewing room door caught his eye. Puzzled, he pushed it open to find her there alone, bent over her work, the room illuminated by the lonely golden halo of a single candle. The flickering light caught the fire in her hair and cast her shadow long and graceful against the wall. She was stitching a constellation of tiny iridescent beads onto a bodice, her needle a patient starfinder in a midnight blue sky of silk. "You're working late," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She started, a hand flying to her chest. "Mr. Reed, I did not hear you." "I'm sorry to have disturbed you. I was on my way to my study." He did not leave. He lingered in the doorway, drawn by the intimacy of the scene. "That looks intricate." "It is," she admitted, her eyes returning to her work. "The beading for the Duchess's ball gown. It must be finished by Friday." "And Madame Dubois leaves such a task to you, alone, by candlelight." A flicker of that pride he had come to recognise warmed her voice. "She trusts my hands are steady." He stepped into the room, his presence filling the small space. "And what of your dreams, Miss Berg? Do they extend beyond stitching for duchesses?" The question was so direct, so personal, it took her aback. She paused, needle held mid-air. No one of his station had ever asked such a thing. I hope one day to have my own shop, she confessed, the words tasting strange and bold on her tongue. A small one, perhaps, where I could choose my own fabrics, create my own designs. He listened, his expression unreadable in the wavering light, and for the first time they spoke not as master and servant, but as two people sharing the quiet space of a late hour. Their true connection, however, was forged in the London fog. A few weeks later, a thick yellow-grey blanket descended upon the city with a sudden suffocating totality. It swirled through the streets, muting sound, blurring the sharp edges of the world, and turning the familiar gas lamps into ghostly, indistinct orbs. Courtney, finishing her work for the day, found her journey home rendered impossible. The carriages were all grounded, their drivers unwilling to navigate the treacherous, blind streets. As she stood hesitating in the grand entryway, clutching her shawl, Darren appeared at her side. "You cannot possibly walk home in this," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "It is not safe." "I have no choice, sir." "Nonsense. I will escort you." Before she could protest, he was shrugging on his greatcoat. He was acting, he told himself, merely out of a sense of duty, a gentleman's obligation to a woman in his family's employ. It was a convenient and necessary lie. Stepping out into the fog was like stepping into another realm. The city's roar was muffled to a distant hum. The imposing facades of the Belgravia townhouses dissolved into murky shadows. They were cocooned, isolated from the rigid watching eyes of society. In this anonymous, misty world, the carefully constructed barriers between them seemed to thin and fray. She spoke of her mother, of the constant worry that was the baseline of her existence, and of the small village in the countryside where she was born. He in turn found himself confessing the crushing weight of his father's legacy, the fear that he was merely an inadequate custodian of a name far greater than himself. The fog became their confessional, its dense veil granting them the courage to be vulnerable. For the length of that walk they were not Mr. Darren Reed, the barrister, and Courtney Berg, the apprentice. They were simply a man and a woman, their shoulders occasionally brushing, their voices low and intimate in the swirling grey. The final fitting for the magnificent ball gown that was to be the centrepiece of Caroline's season marked the culmination of this simmering tension. Courtney was on her knees, making a final adjustment to the hem, a line of pins held between her lips. Darren, as usual, was in his corner armchair, the pretence of reading long since abandoned. As she reached for another pin, a sharp point pricked the tip of her index finger. A perfect ruby-red droplet of blood welled up, a stark jewel against her pale skin. It happened in an instant. Before she could even think to pull her hand away to staunch the tiny wound, he was there. He moved from his chair with a swift, silent urgency that startled her, kneeling before her on the floor. "You've hurt yourself," he murmured, his voice thick with a concern that went far beyond the triviality of the injury. He took her hand. His own was warm and strong, engulfing hers completely. The calloused skin of his thumb stroked over the tiny red bead, smearing it slightly. The touch was electric, a jolt that shot up her arm and settled hot and heavy in the pit of her stomach. It was a gesture of such unexpected disarming tenderness that it stole the breath from her lungs. He did not release her. His thumb continued its slow, hypnotic caress over her fingertip, over the whorls of her skin. He lifted his gaze from her hand to her face, and his eyes were dark with an intensity that made her feel utterly exposed, as if he could see straight into the frantic, hopeful, terrified beating of her heart. The air in the room grew thick, charged with all the words they had never spoken, all the longing they had so carefully concealed. The scent of lavender from the sachets in her sewing box, the whisper of the silk gown, the sight of his dark head bent so close to hers, it all coalesced into a moment of pure, agonizing wanting. It was a near confession, a declaration held in the heated space between their clasped hands, a promise and a peril all at once. His powerful attraction and the ruinous, unthinkable scandal of a liaison with her waged a silent, furious war in the depths of his gaze, and in that moment Courtney knew, with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying, that he was losing. It is a truth universally acknowledged that in a house of many servants, no secret, however small, can long remain confined. The moment of profound tenderness in the sewing room, the master of the house kneeling before the seamstress, his hand holding hers with such reverent care, was not unobserved. A lady's maid, passing the open door on her way to fetch a shawl for her mistress, had seen it all. She was a woman whose own ambitions had long ago curdled into a bitter jealousy, and the sight of such intimacy shared across the unbridgeable chasm of class was an affront she could not abide. The story, embellished with each retelling, began its insidious journey through the servants' passages, a whispered confection of malicious gossip that finally, inevitably, reached the ears of the one person Darren Reed truly feared, his mother. Mrs. Reed was a formidable matriarch, a woman cast in the same unyielding iron as the gates that guarded their home. Her world was governed by the cold calculus of lineage, reputation, and strategic alliances. To her, love was a frivolous luxury. Marriage was a merger. She had already selected the perfect candidate to be her son's wife, the Honourable Miss Eleanor Vance, a banking heiress whose fortune was as vast as her countenance was cold. The union would secure the Reed family's finances for a generation. The whispers of her son's infatuation with a common seamstress were not merely an embarrassment. They were a threat to the very foundation of her carefully laid plans. She cornered Darren in his late father's study, the one room in the house where he felt the weight of his legacy most acutely. Her accusations were precise, her language sharp and contemptuous. They say you have been making a spectacle of yourself with one of the sewing girls, that you fawn over her like a stable boy. Have you lost your senses entirely? Do you have any idea what a scandal of this nature would do to our name, to the negotiations with the Vances? Darren, trapped between the jaws of duty and desire, felt a cold terror overwhelm him. He saw his future laid out before him. The public humiliation, the snickering of his peers, the smirch upon a name his father had kept pristine. He saw the disappointment in his mother's eyes, a weapon she had wielded with devastating effect his entire life. And in a moment of profound, gut-wrenching cowardice, his heart failed him. His feelings for Courtney, so potent and real in the quiet of the sewing room, suddenly seemed a reckless, impossible folly. "It is baseless gossip," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He could not meet his mother's gaze, focusing instead on a portrait of his father above the mantelpiece. "The girl is merely a seamstress, competent at her work, nothing more. I have no interest in the hired help." As fate, in its infinite cruelty, would have it, Courtney was at that very moment walking down the upstairs corridor. She had come to deliver Caroline's finished ball gown, carefully draped over her arms in a protective linen sheath. The door to the study was slightly ajar, and his voice, clear and cold, carried into the hallway. Merely a seamstress. No interest in the hired help. The words struck her with the physical force of a blow. Each syllable was a shard of ice lodging in her heart. All the shared moments, the conversation by candlelight, the walk in the fog, the electrifying touch of his hand on hers, crumbled into dust. They had meant nothing. She had been a fool, a ridiculous, hopeful fool, to believe for even a second that she could be more than an object of passing amusement to a man like him. His casual, brutal cruelty confirmed her deepest, most painful fear, that to him she had never been a person. She was, and always would be, invisible. Her breath hitched, a strangled sob caught in her throat. Without making a sound, she turned and fled back to the safety of the sewing room, the magnificent gown a dead weight in her arms. The world, which had briefly seemed to shimmer with possibility, was once again leached of all its colour, reduced to the stark, unforgiving black and white of her station. Heartbroken and profoundly humiliated, she erected a wall of icy professionalism around herself. She finished the remainder of her commission for the Reeds with a detached mechanical efficiency. She answered Caroline's questions in clipped monosyllables and avoided any room where Darren might be. On the few occasions their paths did cross, she would look through him as if he were made of glass, her face a pale, beautiful mask of indifference. She retreated into the only world that had never betrayed her, the certain, tangible world of needle and thread, of silk and satin. Her spirit ached with a grief so deep it felt like a physical wound, but her hands at least remained steady. Darren, meanwhile, was consumed by a Sveitzen corrosive self-loathing. The memory of his own words, of the lie he had told to save his skin, played on a loop in his mind. He had betrayed not only Courtney, but himself. He had sacrificed something true and vital for the sake of a hollow, meaningless social standing. He buried himself in his work, spending long nights at his law chambers, but he could not escape the ghost of her. The silence in the grand house, once a comfort, was now a constant, deafening reminder of her absence, of the vibrant, intelligent life that had briefly illuminated its shadowed corners, and which he, through his own weakness, had extinguished. The night of the Duchess of Abernathy's grand ball, the most anticipated event of the London season, arrived on a wave of carriage wheels and societal chatter. Inside the Reed mansion, however, the mood was far from festive. Caroline, in a final fit of pre-ball pique over some imagined slight, had yanked at the bodice of her gown with such force that a crucial seam along the waist had torn with a sickening final-sounding rip. Hysteria ensued. It was an hour before they were due to depart. No other gown would do. There was only one solution. A footman was dispatched with breathless urgency to the small, cramped flat where Courtney Berg lived with her mother. She was summoned back to the house she had sworn she would never enter again. When she arrived, her face was a pale, determined mask. She refused all offers of tea, all attempts at apology from a flustered Mrs. Reed. She simply took the damaged gown and ascended the stairs to the sewing room, her sanctuary and her prison. Darren found her there. He had been pacing his study like a caged animal, the sounds of his sister's distress a mere backdrop to the storm raging within him. He knew she had been sent for, and the knowledge was both a torment and a desperate, fragile hope. When he pushed open the door, the sight of her brought him to a halt. She was kneeling by the low light of a lamp, her head bent, her nimble fingers already flying, stitching the ruined seam with a furious precision. She did not acknowledge him. The air was thick with her silence, a silence that was louder than any accusation. The sight of her, so close and yet so impossibly distant, so composed in her heartbreak, finally broke him. The dam of his fear, his pride, and his carefully constructed duty shattered. "Courtney," he began, his voice rough. She did not look up. "It will be mended in a quarter of an hour, Mr. Reed. Your sister will not be late." "To hell with my sister," he bit out, stepping further into the room. "It's you. I must speak with you." "We have nothing to speak of." "We have everything to speak of." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping before her. "What you heard, what I said to my mother, was a lie. A contemptible, cowardly lie born of fear." At last she looked up, her moss-green eyes blazing with a cold, righteous anger. "Fear, Mr. Reed? What convenience!" "It is a convenient thing, is it not, to dismiss the feelings of the hired help when they become troublesome?" The contempt in her voice lashed him like a whip. He flinched. "Yes," he admitted, his own voice raw with self-disgust. "It was that too. I was a coward. I was terrified of the scandal, of my mother, of losing everything my father built. But the greatest lie was not to her, it was to myself, because the truth, Courtney, the god-awful, inconvenient, terrifying truth is that I am in love with you. His confession, so long suppressed, hung in the charged air between them, but it was met not with softness, but with the full force of her pain. She rose to her feet, her movements fluid and furious, her words as sharp and piercing as her needles. "Love," she spat, her voice trembling with a passion that was almost rage. "You call it love to humiliate me, to cast me aside like a soiled garment the moment your position is threatened. That is not love. That is the casual cruelty of a master to his possession. You saw me not as a woman, but as a dalliance, a diversion from your oh-so-burdened life." "No, that is not true," he insisted, stepping closer, his hands clenched at his sides. "I see you more clearly than I see anyone else in my life. I see your strength, your wit, your heart. I see the artist you are, and it terrifies me because loving you means razing my entire world to the ground." "Then let it burn," she cried, tears of fury and heartbreak finally tracing shining paths down her pale cheeks. "But do not stand here and speak to me of love when you lack the courage to even speak my name with respect." The argument was a tempest, a storm of passion that stripped away every last shred of pretense, every layer of social restraint, until only the raw, wounded, vulnerable truth of their two hearts remained. And then words failed. With a sound that was half groan, half plea, he closed the distance between them. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs stroking away her tears. His eyes begged for a forgiveness he did not deserve, and then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, frantic collision, a plea and a confession and a demand all at once. It was the taste of his regret and her rage, of his longing and her sorrow. And for a heart-stopping moment, she resisted, her hands flat against his chest. But then, with a choked sob, her own pent-up desire, so ruthlessly suppressed, surged to the surface. Her hands curled into the fabric of his coat, pulling him closer, and she answered his kiss with all the fierce, aching need she had denied for so long. It was a collision of worlds, of upstairs and downstairs, of duty and desire. Breaking the kiss, breathless, he took her hand. "Not here," he rasped, his voice thick. "Not in this room." He led her from the sewing room, down the silent corridor, past the portraits of his ancestors, their painted eyes judging him. He led her to the library. The room was dark, save for the moonlight slanting through the tall windows, illuminating the scent of old leather, and rain beginning to patter against the glass. He locked the door behind them. Here, surrounded by the weight of his history, he chose to defy it. Their coming together was not a gentle, timid exploration. It was a fierce and transcendent claiming. It was the raw, elemental honesty of two souls shedding their skins, breaking free of the cages that had confined them. His hands, no longer hesitant, moved over her with a reverence that was a form of worship. He unpinned her hair, letting the copper cascade fall over her shoulders, a silken curtain of fire in the moonlight. Her fingers worked at the buttons of his stiff shirt, her touch both hesitant and hungry. He laid her down upon the rich dark velvet of a chaise lounge, the fabric cool against her skin as he lifted the hem of her simple dress. There was a wildness in their coupling, a sacredness born of desperation. It was a surrender not to one another, but to a truth that was more powerful than society, more profound than name or station. Every touch was a word in a new language they were inventing together. Every kiss, a verse in a holy text known only to them. His body spoke of a deep primal tenderness, a need to protect and cherish even in the midst of his fierce passion. And her response was one of utter, trusting vulnerability, a complete opening of the gates of her heart and soul. In this act, she was not submitting, she was meeting him, matching his intensity with her own, claiming him as he was claiming her. It was a sacred sealing of their bond, written not in ink, but in the heated language of flesh and spirit, a promise made in the silent, rain-lashed dark. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, the storm outside mirroring the one that had broken within them, Darren looked at her, at the woman who had undone him and remade him in the space of a single hour. In her arms, he finally understood. True honour was not found in upholding a name or a fortune. It lay in loving fiercely, honestly, and without shame. And Courtney, looking into the vulnerable, unguarded eyes of the man who had broken her heart, found in his utter surrender the strength to forgive. She understood that love, true love, was not a safe harbour. It was a tempest, and its only demand was that you risk your whole heart to its magnificent, terrifying power. The aftermath of the Duchess's ball was not the scandal of a torn seam, but the far more seismic shock of Mr. Darren Reed's quiet, resolute rebellion. The following morning, with a clarity of purpose that felt like breathing for the first time, he went to his mother. He did not raise his voice, he did not argue. He simply informed her in the calm, unequivocal tones of a barrister stating an irrefutable fact that his informal understanding with the Honourable Miss Eleanor Vance was at an end. And then he told her he intended to court Miss Courtney Berg, and that her opinion on the matter, while noted, was ultimately irrelevant. The ensuing storm was precisely as furious as he had anticipated. His mother threatened disinheritance. The Vances were insulted. Whispers turned to audible gossip that spread through the drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs of London like wildfire. But Darren, to the astonishment of all, remained unwavering. He weathered the ostracism and the condescending pity of his peers with a placid conviction that baffled them. He had spent his life shackled by the fear of their judgment. Now, liberated by a love he finally deemed worth fighting for, their opinions were no more than the buzzing of inconsequential flies. He did not hide Courtney away. He did not treat her as a shameful secret to be squirreled away in some discreet cottage. Instead, he celebrated her. He arrived at her modest flat, not in a closed, unmarked carriage, but in his own, the reed crest emblazoned on the door for all the world to see. He walked with her in the park on a Sunday afternoon, ignoring the stares and the hastily turned backs. He discovered that the courage he had always sought in the courtroom was a pale imitation of the courage it took to love openly and without condition. His greatest act of devotion, however, was not in defiance of society, but in tribute to her. He saw the artist his mother and his world refused to see. Using his legal prowess, he established a business venture, and with his own financial resources, he became the primary investor for a new dressmaking establishment in a respectable sunlit corner of Mayfair. It was to be called simply Berg. Months passed, months of hard work and shared purpose. Their love, forged in the crucible of conflict, now settled into the steady, warm rhythm of partnership. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after he'd first barged into the sewing room, Darren entered her shop. It was a world away from the cramped attic room at Belgravia Square. Here light streamed through a grand plate glass window, illuminating bolts of shimmering silks and Welsh wools. The air smelled of jasmine tea and creative energy. Courtney stood in the centre of the room consulting with a client, her expression confident, her posture elegant. She was no longer an apprentice but a proprietress, a creator, a woman in full command of her own destiny. Seeing him, she excused herself, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. He met her in the middle of the bustling showroom, in front of her staff and her patrons, and to her complete astonishment, he went down on one knee. A hush fell over the room. Darren ignored the collective intake of breath. He did not produce a diamond ring, the expected currency of a society proposal. Instead, he held out a small bespoke case of polished silver. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark blue velvet, lay an exquisite set of sewing needles, each one perfectly weighted and balanced, and beside them a single, simple gold thimble. He took her right hand, the hand that had worked so tirelessly, the hand that had held his in the fog, the hand that bore the tiny faded scar from a pinprick. "For the hands that stitched my life back together," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to conceal. He slipped the gold thimble onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Looking up at her, he saw that her eyes were shining with tears, not of sorrow or anger, but of a profound, overwhelming joy. He had not offered her a symbol of his wealth, but a tribute to her strength, her talent, her very soul. Engraved on the inside of the thimble, too small for anyone else to see, were two words: Amor Edificator, Love the Builder. She leaned down and kissed him, a deep, tender kiss that was a promise and a conclusion all in one. It was a seal on a future they would build together, a life constructed not according to society's brittle, unforgiving rules, but with their own hands, stitched with a thread that had been tested and had not broken, destined to last a lifetime.